for God. That's not for the other person. So Paul writes, if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that you will not come together for judgment. And he also writes, so then, my brethren, when you come together, wait for one another. Now, it's funny. I think Protestants interpret this that we all drink at the same time, or we all eat the bread at the same time. But if you think about this, these people were not in the modern age with the digital or mechanical watch. Nowhere in the New Testament does it say at 8 a.m. church services start. Why? Because they were not in the modern age. Nowhere does it say or even suggest when the services start. I mean, we may take a guess, maybe early, but there's no 8:30 sharp, 9, no. And people were living in communities where they probably had to walk to church. Now, in a lot of places where people don't drive, everything is sort of built together, built up. But it still would take time to walk to church. So, what time are we going to have church? Early? Okay, early. So, what this actually could be interpreted to mean when Paul said, because if it's just a matter of waiting for one another so we all eat at the same time or we all drink, well, that really would have no bearing on somebody eating all the bread or drinking all the wine. It would have no bearing. It really wouldn't make sense from the context. Just simply sipping all at the same time wouldn't necessarily, not doing that wouldn't mean that someone wouldn't be able to drink all the wine. So, if we look at it differently, that people, when Paul said wait for one another, that people maybe were trying to get going early, show up early, and eat all the bread or drink all the wine, to try to get a big share before other people show up, then it makes sense. So anyway, Paul, he says, the remaining matters I will arrange when I come. And then he says, now, of course, he's talking about the Lord's Supper there. That's the context. And he says, now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. Now, this is, we're in chapter 12, and we're actually going to see by 14 that the context is still the church coming together. It's not Joe Christian over there and Bob Christian. No. That's not what Paul's talking about. And so you have to put the whole thing into focus. You have to look at the big picture by following what Paul actually says to figure out what is the context, so we can make sense out of these commands. So, and for people who read a chapter a day, it doesn't actually work. Because first, the apostle did not write in chapters. We did that. We divided it up. Modern Christians. And a lot of times you really have no way to see what's actually being said or what it means until you get to the conclusion. If the conclusion is in chapter 3, but today you read chapter 1, you have information, but you don't have a conclusion. So my point is, let's get to the conclusion. So Paul writes, now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I do not want you to be ignorant. You know that you were pagans. When you were pagans, you were led astray to the mute idols, however you were led. Therefore, I make known to you that no one speaking by the Spirit of God says Jesus is accursed. And no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of ministries and the same Lord. And there are varieties of effects, but the same God who works all things in all persons. But to each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for what? For the common good. Again, Paul's talking about the church. For each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Who's given the manifestation of the Spirit? Each one. Do you mean a great minister? Each one. Do you mean the apostle? Each one. Well, we hired an event. Each one. Each one. Each person. Each member of the church. For what? The common good. So, Paul says, for to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, and to another the word of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another faith, by the same Spirit. And to another gifts of healing, by the one Spirit. And to another the effecting of miracles, and to another prophecy, and to another the distinguishing of spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, and to another the interpretation of tongues. But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually just as he wills. Listen to the next verse. For even as the body, who's the body Paul's talking about? He's talking about the believers at Corinth. For even as the body is one, and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Christ. What is Paul talking about here? Paul's talking about the distribution of spiritual gifts in the body. And he goes on to write, for by one Spirit we are all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, we are all made to drink of the one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. What's Paul talking about? In this context, he's talking about the distribution of spiritual gifts in the body to every member, to everyone. Verse 15. If the foot says, because I'm not a hand, I'm not part of the body, it is not for this reason any less part of the body. And if the ear says, because I'm not an eye, I'm not part of the body, it is not for this reason any less part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But now God has placed the members, each one of them, in the body just as he desires. What is Paul talking about? He's talking about the distribution of spiritual gifts. You cannot take one part out of context and throw the rest of it in the trash can. People are teaching parts of this and never look at what Paul's actually saying. In this context, this analogy of the eye, the mouth, the ear, the body is given in regard or as part of the explanation of the distribution of spiritual gifts to each one to many in the body. So Paul writes, if they were all one member, where would the body be? But now there are many members, but one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, or again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, it is much truer that the members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary, and those members of the body which we deem less honorable, on these we bestow more abundant honor, and our less presentable members become much more presentable, whereas our more presentable members have no need of it. But God has so composed the body. Who composed the body? The pastor? No. The apostle? No. God so composed the body. How did God so compose the body? Well, in this context, through the distribution of spiritual gifts to all the members. And so the apostle writes, see, you cannot split this up.